Well, hello there and welcome to Cornerstone Church here in Nottingham. My name's Paul. I'm joined by Daniel this afternoon, and as we lead up to Christmas and we come to Advent, we've been thinking amongst ourselves of the Advent story and how that is a story that is not just revealed to us in the Gospels but is traced back through all of the Old Testament. We read in the prologue to John's Gospel, chapter 1 and verse 14. The Word became flesh and made his dwelling among us. We have seen his glory, the glory of the one and only Son, who came from the Father, full of grace and truth. I think this idea of God dwelling amongst his people and making his glory known is something that goes back to the Old Testament, to the very beginning, to Genesis and God dwelling with Adam and Eve in the garden. And also, if we look at Exodus, the very end of Exodus, the people have been brought out of Egypt and they've been given these commands to build the tabernacle. And at the very end of the book, chapter 40, verses 34 and 35, then the cloud covered the tent of meeting, and the glory of the Lord filled the tabernacle. Moses could not enter the tent of meeting because the cloud had settled on it, and the glory of the Lord filled the tabernacle. So now, what's been kind of going on here? How can we link what we've read in John back to these verses in Exodus?
I think the overarching desire of God is that God in his glory is made known clearly to us, and that he doesn't kind of hide anything of himself from us, but absolutely. That he makes himself fully known to us, which is what we get in the Garden of Eden. If you like, it's the first temple. That's the place where God and his people meet and live and dwell together. In Exodus, God has gathered his people together, and now God wants to dwell with them again. They've been separated through sin, and now through the old covenant, God is making a way that he can dwell with his people. And he does so in this intricately constructed tabernacle, which is the place where his presence lives, where his laws live, where the sacrifices are made for sin. It's the way that people can come to God and where his glory is present. Now, that links very clearly with John, and it might not be obvious at first, but when it says, the Word became flesh and made his dwelling among us, it doesn't mean he came to hang out with us. It literally means pitched his tent. Literally tabernacle. Yeah, exactly. So the tabernacle, when they first made it, was this big tent out in the desert. It was a very intricate, beautiful tent. But what this is saying is that you could read John 1:14 that says, the Word became flesh and built God's tabernacle among us. Yeah. So it's a deliberate word clue to point us back to that old tabernacle. It's not just a coincidence that they happen to be the same word. It's a very deliberate kind of sign that points back to the old tabernacle to say that Jesus somehow concludes what God initially did then in the first tabernacle.
And we get this further on if we turn to 2 Chronicles and chapter 7 and the dedication of the temple. When Solomon finished praying, fire came down from heaven and consumed the burnt offering and the sacrifices, and the glory of the Lord filled the temple. The priests could not enter the temple of the Lord because the glory of the Lord filled it. When all the Israelites saw the fire coming down and the glory of the Lord above the temple, they knelt on the pavement with their faces to the ground, and they worshipped and gave thanks to the Lord, saying, he is good, his love endures forever. I think further on as well, even after the temple and as God's people, as Israel have gone into exile and Judah is to follow, that Isaiah writes in chapter 6, beginning of chapter 6, in the year King Uzziah died, I saw the Lord high and exalted, seated on a throne, and the train of his robe filled the temple. Above him were seraphim, each with 6 wings. With 2 wings they covered their faces, with 2 they covered their feet, and with 2 they were flying. And they were calling to one another, holy, holy, holy is the Lord Almighty. The whole earth is full of his glory. I think reading these 2 passages, you get something of a sense of the overwhelming weight of God's glory, I think.
Yeah, definitely. It's it's presented in a very dramatic way. Further on in John's Gospel, he quotes from Isaiah 6, later in Isaiah 6, and then he says, Isaiah said this because he saw Jesus' glory and spoke about him.
Which part of John's Gospel is this?
That's John 12:41. So what John is saying is that when Isaiah had this vision of the glory of God filling the temple, it was a vision of Jesus Christ, which at Christmas you're going to see everywhere pictures of this little baby that looks cute but helpless, and it's going to limit our view of Jesus. And what passages like Isaiah 6 do is it fights against that to say, no, the glory of God is condensed into this baby for a time, but this child, Jesus, is the glory of God. And the wonder of God becoming man is that these two things hold together.
Yes.
This dramatic, powerful glory where people fall on their faces and, there's kind of thunder and lightning and smoke and all this, and it's really dramatic. And then you've got to contrast that with this tiny little baby in this stable to teenage mum, and the two together is God dwelling with his people again, ultimately and permanently this time in Jesus. And John sets up his gospel to reveal the glory of Jesus. That's his agenda. And he does so not by telling the Christmas story. The other gospel writers do that. What John is interested in doing is telling the story before Christmas, that Jesus has always been the glory of God.
Yeah.
Colossians 1 calls him the image of God.
Yes.
And Hebrews says that he is the radiance of God. And
the exact representation of his being,
exactly.
Beginning of Hebrews 1.
Yeah, exactly. So what John is interested in doing is announcing to the world that the baby is the glory of God, is the eternal glory of God, and that any time we want to look at God and see what is God like, where do we see God's beauty, where do we see God's radiance shining, we have to look at the face of Jesus. And at Christmas, we go to Bethlehem, and like the shepherds who run there, we run and we see the glory of God in the face of a tiny baby who grew to be a man, who hung on a brutal, ugly cross, and who rose again. And that's what John wants us to see.
Thank you, Daniel. And thank you for joining us here at Cornerstone Church. It's our pleasure and our great joy to share something of Advent and see the story traced back throughout creation and the history of God dwelling amongst his people. Thank you.